As I said, it's going to be about our lessons. We did an internal site, and I'm going to go through the story of how we did that and using Apex and Contentful, static site build. So here we go. So we had some break-in between various projects we were doing for clients, so we took on an internal project to do an HR site for our office. One site had already made this, our London office, using one set of technology. They used Sitecore. We thought that was a little heavy-handed for what we wanted. And then our New York office did Express with Contentful. We decided to go serverless, and this is a look at the challenges and rewards of building our internal site that way. In some respects, the project was undertaken in a spirit of investigation and experimentation. Although folks at our office were not particularly familiar with Sitecore, and neither am I really. Anyone here know Sitecore very well? Maybe, sort of. We just heard the rumors, very heavy-handed. For a small static site like this, it was way too much and it was just difficult to work with. And we didn't see a need to have a server for such a small site either. So we decided that we would take this opportunity to use Contentful, which we love, and use AWS services to build this. The goal was to have a very low cost and very easy site to maintain, that we could just hand off authorship to our HR team and let them do what they need to do, and it would just take care of itself. So, we were migrating. So we ignored what London had done because it was entirely irrelevant. But New York had already built this site using Express and Contentful. So it was very easy for us to migrate, in a sense, from that because their data transformations and their layout templates were all perfect. We just swapped them in, and it was easy to have the site running on a local machine in very little time at all. But that was not what our end goal was. So the real work began as we wanted to set this up to be hosted on S3 buckets and to use a Lambda function to do our builds. So let's take a look at the basic architecture that we used here. So Contentful triggers a webhook after they author content, hits our API gateway through AWS services, does a post of all that data to our Lambda build, and we have a source bucket and a destination bucket. And you may wonder, why are there two buckets? Basically, so we can have all of the JavaScript file style sheets and whatnot in one bucket, pull that in, do our processing, and then write everything into the destination bucket. There, of course, are other ways to do that, but that's the way we chose to do it. Then, of course, the magic here is a little DNS magic. We'll get in how to make this happen because it is a secure intranet local company site only, so we wanted to restrict access. So DNS magic, so people just type in the top-level domain that we want and they get to the site. You'll notice a little cron thing off to the side, and I'll get to explaining what that's about in a second. For deployment, we chose to use Apex because it was an easy way of just managing everything. We could multiple build environments. So we've got a staging environment. We've got a preview so that people can preview the content. And also, of course, the production environment. I think in the future we go with CloudFormation as well, but Apex is just great for deploying from our machines. And in case you don't, who's familiar with Apex? Anybody? It's basically a serverless architecture format. It allows you to build, deploy, and manage AWS Lambda functions easily. You can use languages that aren't supported by AWS Lambda, such as Golang. They use a node shim to make that happen. And it has a variety of workflow-related tools for testing your functions, rolling back deploys, viewing metrics, getting logs, and it's the like. So it really is an easy way of deploying to AWS. With all of that done, we thought we were set, and we began publishing content to show off our fabulous static build process. And then we ran into an issue. The webhooks that Contentful fires, we found out our builds were happening faster than things were propagating to the CDN. So every time they were publishing or unpublishing content, it wasn't actually showing up in the build. So we decided, how are we going to solve this problem? One common approach is to just simply set a delay. You know it's going to take a few seconds, a minute or so, for that data to propagate. So just set a delay on your Lambda and wait for that. We decided we'd want to take a different approach. That just didn't sit well with us. So ironically, we chose to put it on a cron job. So every 5 minutes, that site is rebuilt whether it needs it or not, and that's actually worked out perfectly for us. And we decided, what was our timing between rebuilds is just based upon what's free tier usage for the Lambda. We can rebuild that site quite often and maintenance it without having to worry about incurring any real cost. So that's why the cron job. So yeah, so we just rebuild it every 5 minutes, whether I need it or not. We do actually trigger the webhooks as well, but as I said, oftentimes just because the Lambda is so light, it's a small site, it's hitting the querying, the CDN long before the data propagates. So we just tell our people, they get a little panic sometimes, like, we just made a content change, why isn't it showing up? I'm like, just give it 4 minutes and 30 seconds, it'll be there. So we call it our own eventual consistency model. But we encountered some IT issues along the way. Like I said, this is an internal site, and so there's some unique problems. One of the things we want to do is restrict access only to employees. So we want to make sure that only people using the company IP addresses could actually gain access to this. This is an example of an S3 bucket policy that basically does that, restricts what IP range you can use. And the reason we went with this is because we didn't want a single sign-on solution, just too complex for this kind of a thing, too heavyweight. And we also wanted to avoid web servers, which is why we didn't go with Express or something else. So this was the simplest approach, in quotes, but it did take some work to get this to work correctly. We also wanted to have the site very easy to find, and as you can see, default S3 bucket names are not particularly easy to remember. So we have an existing pattern for internal sites in terms of naming, and we want to follow that, and opting for the top-level domain of sfo.start here. We thought that this would be an easy process. We set up a hosted zone with an AWS Route 53 and update our corporate internal DNS to point to that name server. Unfortunately, not true. For a review, if anyone who needs to remember how DNS works, we do have a layer in between the ISP name server because of the internal DNS. But we forgot that in order for canonical names to work with S3 hosted sites, the S3 bucket name must match the domain name. And so we had to recreate all the buckets after we built this and update all of our settings. And the problem was that we weren't using CloudFormation, so we had to do a little bit of trial and error to reproduce the exact security settings that we wanted and everything. So yes, next time, store infrastructure as code, so that'll be easier to update those environments. So our main takeaway from that is custom internal domain is a lot less easy because of the DNS settings, and we had to recreate new buckets and redo the permissions. Finally, we wanted to make sure that the site was available all the time. Or more realistically, we just didn't want to get an angry email from our boss that the site was down. So the last step is to set up health checks. And again, this is kind of tricky because of the two items we mentioned above. We're using a custom domain on an internal DNS. So as far as we've tested out, we can't use AWS health checks because of the IP restrictions. Like health checkers run on EC2 instances that, as far as we know, are in the public cloud, and it doesn't work. So you might wonder, how do we fix this? So let me jump right out there in case anyone's going to raise their hand and ask the question. We haven't yet. We're still working on it and finding a really reliable way of making sure that the site stays up, but yet we don't sacrifice any of the security that we want. Before we handed this project off to our H&R team, again, because we wanted this to be as hands-off once we delivered it as possible, we wrote a very extensive authoring guide for them. This is a small example. This is the particular content type you're going to see in Contentful. This is what it matches up to on the page. We wanted to be really super clear about how all it worked and what the pitfalls might be as I tried to change content around and what it would do on the page. It's also a great way to make friends because they really appreciate when you give them good documentation on how everything is going to work. So here are some steps of where we want to take this. It's nowhere near like Gatsby, but we've been impressed by the fact that there's, out of these various modules or components of what builds the site, most of it is abstract and would be very easy to just build for any site. And really the only things that are unique to any particular site would be the data transformation, how you want it to fit into your layout templates and the rendering of those. So one of our goals is to actually take this framework that we've got and build it out into something where you can just upload a couple of functions, transform your data, give us your layouts, and have an open source product which allows you to quickly and easily build your own static websites with Contentful and some minor data transformation in the background. So that's something we hope, and I hope that maybe a few months we'll be back here talking about that. And that is all I have. Any questions out there? How does it go down? Well, what we have found is that there are a couple of ways in which, even with the authoring guide, our wonderful HR team can author content that somehow breaks the site. And there's sometimes something goes a little wonky in the Lambda build process, but it's usually more often from the Contentful side. And I'll explain. So you saw that there's many of the content types are actually just like, say, groups or aggregations of links. And what we discovered is that if they went in and unpublished a link that was part of a larger portion of the site, Contentful basically gives you back a field reference, but it's null and it's empty, and then our code, which has been updated by now, would break because it would say, get a undefined field property, and the build would break. And so the site would go down until that content was changed. From one perspective, it was as easy as removing that unpublished item or archived item from being referenced in a particular piece of content. But of course, we were also concerned like that shouldn't happen anyway. But that's how a static site goes down. Is something it breaks that way, and usually we have to own that this is something that we didn't make as robust as possible. But again, we want to know when these things happen, and there's your explanation for how a static site goes down, because it shouldn't. It's really the builds fail more than anything else. All right. Well, thank you so much. I appreciate your time.